Thank you. I'd like to thank the International Academy and the Australasian Society of Aerospace Medicine for considering this topic worthy of presentation. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge my friend and mentor, Professor Boris Grassini of Deakin University, for his invaluable help and guidance over many years. Ladies and gentlemen, today I aim to illustrate the distinction between tests on the one hand of safe performance of flying aeroplanes and tests on the other hand of the ability to name colours. To do this, I shall present to you the career histories of 3 professional Australian pilots with a severe form of colour vision defect. Let's take a look at their common features. All 3 are Protanopes. Protanopia is a severe form of colour vision defect. Protanopes are dichromats in which the red cone receptor is absent. No matter how colours are presented, Protanopes may have difficulty in naming them. Each of our pilots holds the Australian Commercial Pilot Licence and may exercise the full privileges of that licence. Each has the multi-engine command instrument rating. Each holds the Australian Airline Transport Pilot Licence. However, none may exercise the privileges of that licence because they have all failed tests of the ability to name colours. Let's start with Pilot 1, who currently flies this aircraft, the ATR 72-600, a modern, sophisticated and fully EFIS-equipped turboprop aircraft. It comes out of the same factory as the AIRBUS A380, with which it shares many common technological features. This aircraft carries about 70 passengers. Pilot 1 flies it from the right-hand seat. His rank is that of first officer. In terms of training, he's fully trained to fly it from the left-hand seat. That is, he has all the qualifications to be captain and in command of this aeroplane, but is prevented from doing so because he has failed tests of the ability to name colours. However, in this aeroplane, the Metro 23, Pilot 1 legally occupies the left-hand seat, and what's more, he's done so in single pilot operations for some 2,000 hours of flight time, in freight operations, and most of that, 95% of it, in night operations. It's hard to imagine a more demanding civilian flying job. Further, he is CASA-approved line training captain for this type of operation. In contrast, in regular public transport operations, the same aeroplane requires a 2-crew configuration with full ATPL privileges in the left-hand seat. So in passenger operations, Pilot 1 is confined to the right-hand seat and he may not sit in the left-hand seat, that is, to be the captain, under any circumstances because he fails tests of the ability to name colours. Pilot 2 flies this aeroplane, the Beech Kingair 200C. He too flies it from the left-hand seat. And he flies it in single pilot configuration, so Pilot 2 is the captain. He's done so for 4 years for the Royal Flying Doctor Service and for the last 2 years for a state-run air ambulance service. This job also must rank highly in terms of degrees of difficulty. As well, Pilot 2 is a CASA-approved line training captain for this aircraft. Before the Kingair, he was a first officer on a Boeing 727-200. That was in night freight operations where the 2-crew requirement restricted Pilot 2 to the right-hand seat because he failed tests of colour naming. Pilot 3 flies this aeroplane, the Dash 8, in RPT operations as a first officer from the right-hand seat. He is also qualified to fly it from the left-hand seat, but he may not do so because he fails the tests that measure the ability to name colours. In a previous job, he taught airline cadets the art of flying at night and instrument flying, and much of that in EFIS-equipped aircraft. He has many hours of single-pilot charter experience in light twins. This is a summary of the three pilots in terms of their aeronautical experience, their in-command hours, their night and IFR hours, the number of Pape approaches flown, their employment history briefly, and the aircraft types. Pilot 1, there are his hours. He estimates some 2,000 Pape approaches. There are the stats for Pilot 2, and he estimates some 1,500 Pape approaches. And finally, Pilot 3, he estimates about 1,000 Pape approaches. All three have a host of other professional qualifications, much too long to list here. None has ever had an accident or an incident, and their references are impeccable and a testament to their professionalism. Clearly, the experience of these three pilots in a range of sophisticated aircraft is extensive and impressive. These pilots have been trained and tested on every practical requirement relevant to their licenses and ratings and the aircraft they fly. And they have passed every single flying test put to them, and may I suggest with flying colours, and the pun is intentional. In this country, our three Protanope pilots may legally fly this aeroplane from the right-hand seat. And that's because the minimum licence required is the CPL. However, they may not fly it from the left-hand seat because that requires the full privileges of the ATPL, which they don't have. For these three pilots, that means passing a test of colour naming. Pass that test and they can be captain of this aircraft. I'll point out that the pilots in the left and the right seats perform identical actions and respond to exactly the same complex information. They alternate roles as pilot flying and pilot monitoring. The training demands and the tests of proficiency of the safe performance are identical and equally rigorous for both seats. Now, I'm not aware of any dichromats, either Dutan or Protan, that have so far flown this aircraft from either seat. However, I do know of several who've flown the Airbus A330, the A320, and the Boeing 737, to name just a few. Many dichromats have passed the signal gun test and are currently employed in Australian airline operations at all senior levels. Seat occupancy for these three pilots is determined solely by their performance on tests of colour naming. There are two such tests that enable migration from the right to the left seat. The first is the control tower signal gun test. The test uses a device called the AIRBUS lamp shown here. Here are the original meanings of the colour and flash combinations of the code, and here is the test requirement. Each pilot gets the chance to name the colour of 6 lights, 3 at 300 metres and 3 at 500 metres. One error is a fail, and that means you stay in the right seat. I suggest that both the AIRBUS lamp and the code are now generally considered to be obsolete, particularly for passenger transport operations. This is largely as a result of modern satellite phone and cell phone technology. This test, I assure you, has fundamental flaws. The second test has the rather grandiose but misleading name shown here. It's unique to Australia. Here are the operational meanings of the various Pape lights, And here is what's being tested when our 3 pilots are asked to do the test. They look at a modified Farnsworth box and have to name the colours of 2 pinpricks of lights. Our 3 Protanope pilots have a 0% chance of passing this test. However, you may recall from an earlier slide that they have flown some 4,500 Pape approaches safely. They've also flown several thousand approaches at aerodromes that have no Pape installed at all. This test too has fundamental flaws. The operational relevance of both of these tests to safe flying is soon to be tested in the courts in Australia. So in summary, for our 3 pilots, the matter of seat occupancy is determined not by tests of ability to fly aircraft safely, but by their performance on tests that measure the ability to name colours. Finally, I'll conclude my presentation by leaving you with this suggestion. To ensure safe performance of duties by pilots with defective colour vision, we need tests that measure their ability to fly safely, not their ability to name colours. On a lighter note, I'd like to mention tests that were in vogue some 25 to 30 years ago in Australia that kept equally qualified and professional pilots out of the left-hand seat. The test was, do you have a penis? I recall that matter went to court and involved a very vigorous court challenge that was eventually resolved in favour of women pilots. And looking back on it a quarter of a century later, it all seems rather silly. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions?